Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and today we're headed south. Keep going south as far as you can go, almost to South America. We're going to a little island called Barbados, and we're talking rum tonight here on the Bourbon Lens podcast. And we are joined by master distiller and master blender Richard Seale from Foursquare Rum. Richard, thank you for joining this episode of the Bourbon Lens.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. And this all started because I took a little trip to Barbados myself in October of 2022, and man, I was not expecting what I got from the rum. Ultimately, after I did a flight with your wonderful tour guide Dario, who was awesome and hosted us. But man, rum and whiskey really can get hand in hand and can confuse the average bourbon drinker pretty easily if you're not careful because of the flavor profiles and consistencies. And we'll get there in a minute. But, for you, growing up a Bayesian, as I say locally, what's it like to be part of the rum industry, part of the backbone of the economy there in Barbados?
Well, yeah, I mean, I obviously I grew up in it, and as a youngster, we didn't really, it was very much, we thought of rum as our thing and really didn't think about much of rum outside of the island. We didn't really think about, that many other places did rum and, or exporting rum. It was a little bit of an insular world, but I certainly grew up in it. And you just kind of grew up, it was very pervasive in the culture. Which can be both a good and a bad thing. It's in many ways, in other words, it can be just an ordinary part of life. I mean, it's just a sort of routine element in everybody's home and celebrations and partying. And so, yeah, it's probably, I think when we started to export rum, I think, we then, that was more eye-opening in terms of introducing rum to people and seeing a different response. And of course, so that, that really sort of shaped what I wanted to do with it, which of course was to sort of bring the best of rum to the rest of the world. Because one of the things that is a bit striking when you are rum producer from the small islands, which I think is unusual compared to any other spirit, is you go outside and you find rum, but rum not as you know it. I always say this: imagine you're a bourbon guy and you travel from Kentucky over to the UK and you see a bottle of a branded bourbon and you've never heard of the brand, and you taste it and it doesn't taste anything like bourbon, that's the experience of a rum producer from the traditional rum producing islands like Barbados or Jamaica or Martinique or something like that. That's what you have, and that's unusual. And it's a long historical legacy where a lot of rum was branded and shaped outside. So you have brands outside that they were developed completely outside, and none of us want to call any names, but I don't think I'm being unreasonable if I sort of say Captain Morgan Spice. I mean, you would never find a product like Captain Morgan Spice being drunk in somewhere like Barbados or Jamaica or whatever. I mean, this is a totally foreign product. And then even on the English side, there would be some English brands of rum, again developed in England, that didn't taste anything, even though they're sourced from the West Indies, but they didn't, the whole branding and the concepts, and you don't really you find some, and we have one, but you don't find, for example, the pirate brands of rum in the Caribbean. All of this is kind of really external branding. So I think when you are in the rum business, and I say from traditional producing country, you do have a bit of a shock, which you would not experience in other spirits. If you go abroad and you see a bottle of bourbon, it's probably a brand you perfectly well recognize. Someone from Scotland goes and sees a bottle of Scotch whiskey, it'll be a brand they recognize. Whereas a Barbadian could go abroad and see a brand of rum or taste of rum. And, you know, even, and again, I don't want to mention brands, but, you know, even someone like Bacardi really kind of carved out a very distinct, their own Spanish style. So while that's a, you know, totally legit, authentic rum style, obviously for someone like Barbados, coming from Barbados or Jamaica, they would find that very foreign. They would find that very unusual style.
And is that just because it's clear spirit, not aged spirit? Or, I mean,
it's just really the Spanish kind of really led by Bacardi, you know, really kind of pioneered their own, yeah. And this, you know, and I do a lot of, this would take up much more than the time we have to go on and understand how rum diversified. But basically rum did widely. So today, you know, it's a very diverse spirit. Having said that, people make the wrong comparison. They sort of say rum is very diversified and bourbon is not, but bourbon is a diverse part of whiskey. So you sort of make the wrong comparison. You know, whiskey is diversified. You just lump. You don't lump them all together that you tend to do in rum.
No, I think that makes sense. And I think what's really interesting about rum production, right? It's made two ways, right? Like there's sugar cane and then like a sugar syrup or a sugar byproduct, right? From the sugar cane, right? So can you talk a little bit about the distillation process and the two different types of distillation there on the island in Barbados?
Yeah. So the first thing really to kind of grasp is rum making is more similar to brandy making and whiskey making in the sense that the raw material contains sugar. So we don't have that preliminary step of converting starch to sugar. So rum making, if you might say in its simplest form, is very analogous to brandy. Brandy, you crush the grapes, you get grape juice, you ferment it, you get wine. Sugar cane, you crush the cane, you get sugar cane juice, you can ferment the sugar cane juice into sugar cane wine. You distill the sugar cane wine, you get rum. So there's a direct analogy there. In the modern era, of course, we tend to think of rum as being either or, sugar cane juice or molasses. That's actually a modern separation. And when I mean modern, I mean about 100 years old, or 100 plus. We're in the spirits world. Modern is anything this last century. Because historically on a sugar estate, you crush the sugar estate did everything. So sugar estate grew the cane, crushed the cane, and made sugar, molasses, and rum on the estate. So in a typical sugar estate scenario, both juice and molasses went into rum making. Molasses is, so let me see if I can explain this on audio only, but basically you crush the cane, you turn it into juice. When you're making sugar, in this very simplified version of how you make sugar, you then evaporate that juice into a syrup. And then the last step is a very clever step now done in a vacuum pan where you heat on a specific temperature and pressure and the crystals and the sucrose within this sugar syrup will crystallize. And then you go to a centrifuge, you separate out the crystals from the syrup, and that remaining liquid is your molasses. So your molasses is basically a very, very concentrated sugar syrup in which some of the sucrose has been removed in the form of crystals. So they're all sugar syrup or sugar juice, but it's a question of the spectrum from fresh, unevaporated juice right through to thick, dark molasses.
Yeah, and I think that was the interesting thing to me is like you all at Foursquare are doing a little bit of both, right? Right now, the large part is molasses, right?
Correct. So one of the missions that we've had is to kind of re-blur that line.
Yeah.
So today, and we've been doing this since about 2016, albeit in a very small way in 2016, 2017, scaled it up more in 2018, 19, and each year increasing. But today we can sort of proudly say that we're making rums both from molasses and juice, which is not novel. It's really the historical way. As they say, if you were to visit a rum distiller 200 years ago and you asked him whether his rum was from juice or molasses, he'd probably look at you a bit strange. Yeah. So we want to reblur that line. And that's not the only reason, of course, we're crushing cane at Foursquare, but certainly that's one of the motivations to kind of refocus the fact that rum is from sugarcane and maybe less of the focus on this notion that it's either from molasses or from juice. Or, sometimes people, in fact, it's sometimes quite amusing because people will say, well, rum is from sugarcane or molasses. Well, they're both from sugarcane. Molasses comes from sugarcane. Or you can get even worse scenario where there's some other form of molasses, like beet molasses, and someone says, "Oh, well, you can make rum from that." No, you can't. Rum does not come from sugar beets; it comes from sugarcane. So we want to, we're very sort of determined to reblur that line.
So does one convert to alcohol easier, or what is the motivation behind using one or the other, or a mixture of both?
No, both are highly fermentable substrates. What we have done to sort of complement the two of them, rather than set out straightforwardly to make rum from molasses and to make rum from sugarcane juice in the same manner, what we do is we do two very complementary fermentations. And I sometimes describe us as a little bit schizophrenic, because there are two different areas of the fermentation, and the molasses fermentations in the south of the distillery. And if you visit us in the molasses area, we're using added yeast. We're doing modern fermentation, and again, 100-year-old techniques. So we're adding yeast, we're controlling temperature, we're doing all the sort of modern good things of fermentation. And if you ask me about the importance of yeast, I'll probably go, well, meh, who cares about yeast? Which is a little bit like Scotch whiskey. Sort of, what's the big deal about yeast? And for everyone who's having a panic, I'm not saying that yeast is not important. It's just how you turn your knobs and your dials in your process. And so yeast might be not one in which you turn your dials. But then if you go, and of course, the other thing with molasses then in the south, what will happen is we'll use molasses of a certain spec. You think about molasses, it tends to be quite homogeneous because it's coming from centralized sugar factories who are pulling cane from multiple fields, and the processes are similar. The varieties of cane are similar across the region. So therefore, you don't, again, I don't want to say molasses doesn't have terroir, but it's much more homogenized. So if you ask, about terroir in our south section of the distillery, we maybe don't get so excited about it. But then if you come and you visit the north side now of the distillery, you're going to get the complete opposite philosophy, because we're doing natural fermentation there. So we do 100% natural fermentations, no yeast is added. We're relying totally on the natural yeast with the cane. So terroir now is everything. The fermentations are different, not just every year. They're different from the beginning of the season to the end of the season. Yeast, of course, is different every year. As I say, different yeast changes by the month. The bacteria, which plays a big role in the flavor of rum, maybe more so than not maybe, but probably definitely more in many rums of the world today, particularly in Jamaica. Bacteria profile of the substrate plays a big role in the final result. And so all of that varies. So you have a complete, different philosophy of rum making on the juice. So we didn't just use the juice just for the sake of using a different raw material. We really have a completely complementary, well, we think it's a complementary way of carrying out fermentation.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is, like, not only that like you're using two different styles of raw materials, but like on an island, a tenth of the size of Rhode Island, which is a very small state here in the US, right? Like there's rum as a culture. Like there's multiple rum producers doing different things, whether it's yourself, Mount Gay, plantation, what have you. Like, I think that's what's interesting about the fabric.
Yes. So while rum, if you go back far enough, you would find more commonality between. So if you sort of visited the islands in the 18th century, you would find more commonality among the rum makers of, say, Barbados and Jamaica or Martinique. And of course, if you go today, I couldn't possibly give you three better examples of the diversity of rum than a Martinique rum, a Jamaica rum, and a Barbados rum. And again, that's a whole other hour-long seminar as to how that diversity occurred. But yes, even within that, you do have a lot of individuality, and you always did. So, today there is 4 distilleries left in Jamaica. In 1898, there were, I think it was 148 distilleries or something like that. In Barbados in the 1850s, there were 150 distilleries. You would have certainly, while you would have found a commonality, you would have certainly found many people having their own little unique ways. And yes, it is very interesting in Barbados that you have 3 distilleries like us, Mount Gay, and Nicholas, and we're all crushing cane, but we're all doing 3 different things to the cane. So I'm crushing cane, doing natural fermentations. Mount Gay is crushing cane and making molasses, and Nicholas is crushing cane and making sugar syrup.
So yeah, there's all individuality, but like I think after going to Barbados, right, as an individual, like you can see that each part of the island has their own unique way of doing things, right? Just in general, like it's kind of divided by the area and the necessity and the raw materials that you have at your hand and the materials that you have the ability, availability to. And so I think that's what makes it unique is, you all are on the far south side, is that right?
So we're in the southeast.
Yeah, southeast. And then the other 2 are kind of like middle, one's middle north, one's kind of middle west.
Yes.
A little bit. Look at me nailing my geography right now.
Yes. So I mean, basically the 3 of the 4 that are crushing cane are doing so because they're all sitting amongst cane.
Yeah.
Whereas one is in more or less in the city. So, and again, there's a whole, historical reason for the advent of city-based distilleries, which were separate from sugar estates.
Yeah.
Again, that's another long story. But yes, but it's one of the seminars that I did at the Barbados Rum Experience back in November was this sort of Barbados rum back to its roots, where I sort of went through the history of how rum was always done on the sugar estate. So there was always this direct link between the estate and the rum making. And I went through all the various economic reasons as to why they got split. And then the payoff at the end of the lecture was to tell you, all the wonderful new changes in the last 10, 15 years where we're bringing those links back. So there's a direct link between, the cane grown at Mount Gay and the rum that Mount Gay is producing, and the cane grown at Nicholas and the rum that Nicholas is producing. In our case, the cane that we have been using is not immediately from Foursquare, but from a nearby plantation. And what we have been doing is now planting our own cane at Foursquare. The reason for that is that, again, I don't want to confuse everybody, but there's a Foursquare distillery and the Foursquare estate that has the cane around Foursquare are actually 2 separate entities. They're independent of us. And we have acquired land from them. And as we have expanded Foursquare, we have encroached into the surrounding estate and now growing cane. But the reason why we didn't use them is because they were all mechanically harvested. And the estate that we are working with is one of the last on the island to do hand cut cane.
Mm.
And the type of fermentations that we are doing, we need the hand cut cane. I prefer the hand cut cane.
So from, I guess seed to harvest, what's the life cycle of cane? Is it multiple years? I mean, what are we
So
talking?
from planting, it's about 18 months, but then you can regrow after the first harvest, and that's about a year.
Okay.
So what will happen is in Barbados, typically, new cane is planted, and they'll grow for several crops, and then depending on the yield, then they'll may replant again. For our work, for the Foursquare cane that we will harvest in the future, we're doing obviously plant cane, and we'll continue to do so fresh plants every 18 months.
And so, like, as you all go through this process to produce your all's distillate, right? Like at the end of the day, that's what it is, and put it into barrels. Like, what's the average like resting time? Because you all have a multiple rums in your portfolio, whether it's yourself or Dorley's, or producing for other people. Like, what's the average rest time for your rum?
Right. So we talked there about the fermentation, and so just moving on with distillation. So as you would have seen at Foursquare, and this is also one of the special things to see in rum. I described it. When you were in that still area, I would say you saw three relatively special things. The first special thing that you would have seen is the fact that there's pot stills.
Yep.
And that's a reflection of the fact that we're a 17th century industry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in modern times, we have loads of pot stills from new craft distillers. But if you look at, speaking broadly as a category, single malt whiskey, very old pot stills, cognac, very old pot stills, American whiskey, younger, the young kids for us.
Yeah.
19th century column stills. And so when you look at, and you see the distinction also in rum. So the same way American whiskey is column still and the single malt is Scotch is pot still, you can see it in rum. Cuba, column still. Come to Barbados and Jamaica, pot still. So that's the first thing. You're looking at an island with an unbroken legacy of pot stills from the 17th century. The second thing then is to see the two stills side by side. So when the column still came in, and again, that's another long story explaining how that came about. But one of the interesting things, and this is why I described that the modern style of Barbados rum, and again, I'm using the word modern for the last 100+ years, is the blend of them both. So when the column still came in, we evolved to creating a blending style of rum. And the distinction with blended Scotch whiskey is the distilleries themselves had them side by side. So when you think of a blended Scotch whiskey, they're blending from different distilleries. So, the grain whiskey distilleries in the south with the column stills, and the single malt whiskey in the pot stills. Whereas in rum, you visited us and you saw column still and pot stills side by side. If you'd gone to Mount Gay, you would have seen a pot and a column still side by side. If you'd gone to Appleton in Jamaica, you would have seen a pot still and a column still side by side. So that's the second special thing in that room. And the third special thing in that room is the pot still probably didn't look like any pot still you had ever seen in your life.
Amen.
And that was actually the subject of my second seminar, the Barbados Rum Experience. The evolution of what we call the Caribbean double retort pot still. And so what happened in rum, in the historic producers, we evolved a more advanced form of pot or batch still distillation, which is a double retort. And we went through many iterations, and that was the purpose of the seminar, to kind of show the evolution and kind of how we got here. And we got here a very long time ago. I mean, the double retort pot still was pretty common in Jamaica by the mid 1800s. But yes, so the pot still, as you saw, did not look like a Scotch whiskey pot still, and it did not look like a cognac pot still. The rum very much has its own evolution. So that would have been the three special things in that still room.
Yeah, and it was really interesting seeing the new pot still that you all had, right? Because you do some
Yes.
column
So in the
still
still
the
room,
whiskey.
one
Yeah.
column still and two pot stills.
Yeah.
Yes. And you saw the one.
And the columns were huge. Like they're not small columns. Like they were multiple stories tall and wide.
Well, again, it's all context. We would, in terms of column stills, as how big column stills get, they're tiny.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, if you went to, my good friends at McCarty, you would see some giant column stills, or you went to big European vodka producers, you would see some giant. So in that context, maybe compared though to a sort of, average or smallish bourbon producer, yes, maybe they look quite big. But don't forget they're insulated, so that makes them look a little bigger. Many of the column stills you see out there are not insulated, so they don't look quite as fat.
Yeah.
So I think that makes them look a little bigger than they actually are.
Now, is that insulated because of your climate?
No, it's just modern, so traditionally they didn't insulate them, but today anybody building, so that column still went in 96, and it's just energy and safety. If you insulate hot things, you protect people.
Yeah. So since we're talking about the distillation process, and you guys have two, I guess, fermented products that are going,
Yes.
through your process, are you distilling those separately, or are you distilling kind of a combination of that?
Well, we do a bit of both.
Okay.
But
so you guys have a lot of variety of every stage of the game. Yeah.
And we don't
sound like a craft producer.
We don't reveal all our secrets, but right now only the cane juice only goes to the pot stills. The simple reason we just don't have enough. So everything that we ferment from cane juice, we can accommodate in the pot stills. If we couldn't accommodate all in the pot stills, then we'd probably column distill some. But right now we have enough pot still capacity to do it. And of course, the type of rum, again, it comes back to the type of rum that we're making from the cane juice. Natural fermentation is obviously very big, pungent, full-bodied rum. So it's best suited to do that in a pot still.
Gotcha. Jake, it sounds a lot like craft whiskey distillers, like our friends Starlight, where they've got all the different mash bills, all the different styles of distillation, and
so
lots of variety throughout the stage.
If you look at rum, what you do, while you do see different distillation, one of the things that is very common in rum, and you particularly see this more in Jamaica than anywhere else, is you see a lot of variety driven from the fermentation side. So if you look, for example, in Jamaican rum, there are many different what they call marks of Jamaican rum. You're familiar with this, Jake? Yeah. Yep. So, and that's evolved because all of those marks once upon a time were marks of an individual distillery. And then when the distillery closed, the recipe could be moved to another distillery.
Yep.
Because the fermentation recipe. So there was a lot more commonality on the stills. So you could reproduce the mark at another distillery following the recipe. So the mark would move. So that's why today we've got a small number of distilleries, but a wide number of marks. And if you go to Guyana, you'll see a slightly different culture. If you go to Guyana, there's one distillery left, but inside that distillery has many stills, because when a distillery in Guyana would close, to maintain producing that mark, they used to have to move the entire still. So if you go to the single distillery in Guyana, has it's like a museum because it has so many stills in it, and they all came from original estates. But in order to to keep making the rum that estate was known for, you had to move the whole still.
That ain't cheap.
So,
it's
So it does certainly make, so you might hear that, Guyana only has one distillery, but that's slightly misleading. You go in that distillery and you see about 6 different distilleries inside that distillery.
Yeah. And so, like let's focus on Foursquare for a bit. We've talked about like rum as a general category and a little bit about your all's distillation process, but let's talk about the rum you're producing. And sometimes it's really easy for me after going to the distillery and doing a tour with Dario. Like if you're ever in Barbados, like that sounds bougie as hell that I'm saying this, but like if you're ever in Barbados, like go to Foursquare, like it's a great tour and there's a lot of great rum to try. And I told him multiple times, like, I feel like I'm drinking whiskey. Like that's how I felt. Like I really enjoyed it, the flavors and the complexities. And we have two of some of your LTOs, your limited time offerings, with us today, the 2010 and the Sovereignty. But just talk to us a little bit about just the brands that you all carry from a rum production perspective.
So one of the things that happened in Barbados is as there was consolidation, there used to be. Let me take a little step back. So in Barbados and Jamaica is very similar. There was a separation between distiller and blender bottler, just like Scotch whiskey. So when you think of blended Scotch whiskey, all those historic brands, the Johnny Walkers and Dewars and Ballantines, they were all blenders. They're all sourced from multiple distillers and blends. And it's the same thing in Barbados and Jamaica. And that's why you have, for example, a famous brand like Myers. Again, it was a blender brand bought from different distilleries. And that's why you have a Ray and Nephew and an Appleton, because Ray and Nephew is a historic merchant blender who acquired the Appleton estate. So that's why you have two names from that company. And that's same thing. You have the Seale family, and we own an estate called Foursquare. But over the years in Barbados, there was consolidation of brands. And contemporary of my great-grandfather was Martin Dorney. And we acquired that brand in 93. So we continue to produce that brand up to today. We also produce other brands on the island that we've acquired over the years and consolidated, but we don't export them. They're just local brands. And of course, then we do our eponymous brand, Foursquare. So that's a little bit of why we have the different brands. Their brands has been just consolidated over the years, and of course all the sourcing of the brands, of course, all migrated to Foursquare.
So one of the things that I enjoyed was the variety of flights, and you all produce these amazing rums that are that carry a lot of depth and complexity. And let's talk through the two that we have today. So two of the most critically acclaimed rums from Foursquare, from what I understand, especially the 2010 rum. So let's start with that one, and then we'll move into the Sovereignty. So we'll start there.
So a few years ago, I decided to release vintages. Vintages gave me an opportunity. I was always a little bit, in the spirits world. When you think of the spirits world, and you think of the core of the spirits world, it's all about, big brands and being very consistent, and, the buyer going in and making sure his, bottle tastes exactly the same like the previous bottle. And that's fine. That's a big part of our world. But I was always a little bit jealous of sort of my wine friends who could sort of celebrate the nuances of each year. And it also gave me an opportunity to kind of move a little bit with the trends of the drinkers. So in other words, when one of our classic releases is our R.L. Seale 10-year-old and R.L. Seale 12-year-old that's available in the States. And, but the mission with those is to be consistent. The beauty of the vintages is that I can sort of move with how I think what the drinkers want this year. So it's a little more obviously fun for me to do the vintages. And we decided obviously to release the vintages under the Foursquare label because we sort of felt that they were, each year the kind of core representation of what we were doing. That's why they're all ex-bourbon casks, because that's kind of the backbone of what we're doing. Barbados rum has used American oak for a very long time. We've used American oak before there was bourbon. Staves would be traded from, New England, from Canada, staves and saltfish would be traded, and the islands would trade back sugar, molasses, and rums. So we've been putting rum in America now for a very, very long time. And so the ex-bourbon is kind of the backbone of what we do. And so that's why the vintages are ex-bourbon. And 12 years is a kind of a good balance between releasing something every year at a reasonable volume, because of course you get older and older it gets, there's less and less volume, and giving you something very nice and mature. So that's how the vintages came about. 2010 is the latest one. So it follows in the line of the previous ones: cask strength, let's say 100% ex-bourbon, blend of the pot and the column still. It's kind of the backbone of what we do at Foursquare.
Yeah. So it's really nice. The bottle, we'll take pictures and post it during the podcast. But as Richard mentioned, cask type ex-bourbon, cask aging 12 years, distillation pot and column, and released July of 2022. So this is released at 60% ABV or 120 proof. And so this is the one I've been sipping on. I personally love this expression that you all produce, because it does have a lot of bourbon characteristics to me. But Scott, like I know you're not a huge rum connoisseur or not dove into this arena so much. Like, so I just would be really interested to get your thoughts on this 2010 before we go into the expert that is Richard, who's blended and distilled this through the ages.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I've not aced the rum certification or anything like that yet.
He got 100 on the bourbon certification, so he's all highfalutin now.
Honestly, I know shit about rum, much less aged rum, and so this, I believe, is my first time ever tasting aged rum intentionally. Right, so I might have had some, I'm 36, so over the past 15 years of legal drinking, maybe once, but it's a new world to me. And I agree with what Jake's saying. It's like, it's very characteristic of bourbon. It has a lot of those similar notes. Now I can tell that it's a lot sweeter than bourbon, because how it's made, but I don't obviously get corn or anything like that, but you do get a lot of sweetness up front. And so starting with the 2010, it's like I get a lot of like tropical fruit, like banana, pineapple, but it's always like charred pineapple or like warm bananas, like bananas Foster, things like that. So deep, dark, rich flavors. So this is a different world for me, but it's definitely one I'm looking forward to exploring a little bit.
So, whiskey is a natural audience for us, and the reason why I say that is, and why you would have some familiarity when you taste, is really on two levels. The first level is at the end of the day, fundamentally it's a distilled spirit matured in wood, and so some of the characteristics of quality or quality spirit are going to be similar. So the same, the mouth feel, the length, the grit, all of these things that you can associate in one spirit category will go across any spirit category. So whether you're drinking a single malt whiskey or a good cognac, or all of these things. Obviously, bourbon and rum, particularly this rum, share a same wood. So now you're on a second level, you're obviously going to be picking up certain similar flavors because we're using the same wood. What I would point out that's very different in rum compared to bourbon, of course, all bourbon is in new wood. Rum like 2010, like all the previous vintages, is in a variety of wood, of ex-bourbon. So some of it was first fill ex-bourbon, so none of it's new wood. And then some of it's first fill ex-bourbon, but some of it's second fill, third fill, fourth fill. So 12 years ago, we were refilling very old cask and compared to a bourbon fill. A bourbon every time is filling in a brand new cask. Whereas 12 years ago, some of the rum that's in that 2010 went into a very old cask, a cask that may have been 10 or 12 years old. In other words, in addition to the whatever years it had done in bourbon. So this, of course, is going to make for a very different result. And what does tend to happen is, even though you can get a lot of sweetness in new wood from the wood sugars, what tends to happen is rum's distillate has a kind of a seductive sweetness to it. Not because it's really actually sweet, but more because the flavor notes we kind of associate with sweetness. And of course, when I use this blend of these different casks, I'm allowing the distillate to shine a little bit. So what you tend to find is you get the sweetness on the front. But if it was sweetness from sugar, it would tend to destroy a little bit the finish.
Yeah.
But it's not sweetness from sugar, so the finish is not destroyed. You get the length and the grip.
Well, so that's the thing that I like about this is the tannin of the oak, right? Like, even though it might be a second, third, fourth fill barrel, right? It does have some tannin. So it does give you that woody, oaky, vanillin fill on your palate. And it is very creamy, especially 2010. I thought was a very creamy distillate and just finish from start to finish. So it is those tropical fruits, but it does lean towards those more complex, darker flavor profiles on the back end of the palate. And I think that has a lot to do with the barrel. And since you all are using a variety of different barrels, like, what's the most common, like, do you all, like, or I guess, let me say it this way. What is, your all's perspective of barrels? Do you all rechar them? Do you retoast them or anything to the barrels once you get them, or anything in between fills?
So the simple answer to that is for the rums in front of you, no. It's not a routine thing. So we do rechar, but that's something completely separate. The backbone of what we do are ex-bourbon. The other main barrels that we use are ex-sherries and ex-madeiras. And again, that's also something very, one of the distinguishing points between, Scotch whiskey and American whiskey, and it's the same with rum, is, American whiskey culture is based on new wood because that's what was available to you. When you look at Scotch whiskey had no cooperage, so it's a refilled category. And it's the same with rum. We have no cooperage here. We have no trees. We have no forests. So historically, rum has always been a refill cask. And so even when we imported staves, we reused them because, of course, importing staves is expensive. So not that I want to start any bourbon fights, but if someone says to me, it's not bourbon if it's in a sherry cask, I completely agree with them, because bourbon's culture is based on the wood that was available. And, whereas Scotch whiskey in a sherry cask is as authentic as Scotch whiskey as you could get, because that's what they did. And it's the same thing with rum. We would use refill casks. So the backbone of what we do is American oak ex-bourbon. But we do a lot of the other different casks as well.
Yeah. And I think getting into those other casks, right? So like the Sovereignty has that ex-sherry in it, right? So
Correct.
That's where you start to lean on additional flavor profiles of the finished barrel. So in that second barrel, non-ex-bourbon, are those first fill ex-sherry, or can those be multiple use as well?
That's a good point to raise. In the case of Sovereignty, none of those were first fill ex-sherry barrels. They're very old sherry barrels. And again, it sort of reflects what we do with, old barrels are a big, big integral part of how we operate at Foursquare. And the very old sherry barrels as well. So, because I think that's one of the things that, when we see a lot of spirits doing finishes, I totally agree that sounds gimmicky. It raises our suspicions that it's just a shortcut to, add sherry into a product or something like that. And so we don't really, when we source a cask, it's not for finishing, it's for maturation. If you look at Sovereignty, which is in not first fill, it's kind of illustrates that point perfectly, because there's no sherry floating around in that cask when we filled it in rum.
Yeah.
But that wood that has, been seasoned with sherry is forever indelibly printed with those effects.
Yep.
So it'll always be forevermore a sherry cask, or certainly not a bourbon cask. But we choose it because of the quality of the cask.
Well, it's a bigger cask, so different surface area, right?
So that's why we don't. Yeah, that's why you say we don't do finishes. So Sovereignty is a blend of rums that are either 14 years in ex-bourbon. They were double matured, 3 years ex-bourbon, 11 years in ex-sherry cask. And it was not a first fill ex-sherry cask.
Yeah, this one is wildly different and more complex flavors, I think, than the 2010. I think the 2010 is really like is a rum for a bourbon drinker. This one is a rum for a Scotch drinker, right? Like you're used to those sherry notes, like those shine through in here, like the plum, the little bit of grape, right? Like those things shine for me in this one from nose to palate. It's a little bit sweeter. It's got that drying effect like a big Cabernet or like a bold Syrah, like one of those two types of wines. And so I think that's what's really unique about this is it leans to a different type of drinker, but in the whiskey realm altogether, which I think is really cool.
Yes. Well, again, that comes back to what I was saying about the first level. Rum will appeal to anybody who our style of rums, or certainly, as I say, the style of rums you find in the region, not necessarily the style of rums out there. The ones that you're sort of coming and surprisingly discovering, they're going to appeal to any spirits enthusiast on that first level. And then, of course, on the second level, yes, because as you say, the 2010 is going to appeal more to the bourbon drinker because, yeah, we're sharing the same cask. But yeah, I mean, any good spirit should appeal to any spirit enthusiast. And that's the challenge for us in rum, is to kind of show the world that there's this other element to rum that they may not be so familiar with, because their view of rum has been shaped by, again, I don't want to call any brands, but has been shaped by very, very different style of products. And they're not the products that are really ones that have been created in the region. They have been created outside the region. And so, yeah, so you come to Foursquare, Jake, and you get this pleasant surprise because you had no idea this sort of kind of rum exists, and it does. And so our audience, when we go to an export market like the US or Europe, we look to the whiskey audience because, again, I don't want to call any names, but, someone who's drinking a rum that's, highly sweetened and flavored is not our audience.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's a person that's drinking a rum punch, and there's a person who like wants a bold rum neat or on a cube.
And the thing is, and we often get confused a little bit in our mission. We're not necessarily against any individual product that's, sweetened and flavored. It's just when they try to pass themselves off as a kind of an authentic rum or rum from a particular region, then we have a problem. Don't pass off something that it's not. There's a huge audience out there that likes sweetened products, and that's fine. The thing that probably bothers me the most about the people who like sweetened products is that they drink terrible ones when there's some fantastic sweetened products out there, like, for example, sweet sherries and ports and Madeiras, and they eschew those as being old-fashioned, and then they drink some absolute crap neutral spirit flavored junk. And I'm like, it's okay to like sweet, but why do you don't drink the junk one? How about this lovely Madeira over here? You have no idea what you're missing.
I agree.
And we've seen these wonderful, sweet fortified wines shrinking in their consumption. And at the same time, people drinking more and more sweetened spirits. And this makes no sense to me whatsoever. If I want something sweet, I'm going to get a nice port.
Yeah.
Well, there's been a lot of news stories about who's drinking all this sherry that's producing all these barrels. I think the barrels are worth more than the sherry.
Well, that's the other side of the sherry story is that the sherry barrel that you're typically used in maturing of Scotch or rum is not a sherry barrel making sherry for sherry consumption. So historically, it started with sherry being shipped to the UK and reusing the sherry shipping barrel. So of course, as Scotch has grown and sherry now has to leave Spain in a bottle, it has done for the last 40 years, you've had to invent the sherry barrel. And so the sherry barrel is really a barrel which is either sourced new or sourced from a winery, seasoned with sherry, and then that sherry goes on and makes vinegar or whatever. It's not an actual sherry barrel out of a sherry bodega. Having said that, there are a few of those casks around, but they're the minority. I do have a few of those casks, but the vast majority of sherry casks used by the Scotch whiskey industry or the rum industry are what we call seasoned casks. And the sherry regulator now, when you source a sherry seasoned cask, it now comes with a QR code stamped on it to show that it is a genuine sherry seasoned cask that has had sherry in it for a minimum time. Again, not sherry for consumption, but it is a genuinely produced sherry cask.
Yeah. And you'll have to go back and
that because people were selling, sherry casks that might have had, sherry in it for a few days.
Yeah.
So that is being tightened up. But yes, it's important not to confuse the two. Because you're right. There's not enough sherry consumption to provide the sherry cask. No, the sherry cask is really a manufactured item in its own right.
Yeah. You have to go back and listen to our Dalmore episode to hear about some 30-year-old sherries.
Yeah, so there are legit ex-Solera casks out there, but they're not something of a sustainable supply to I have 19 of them. Very proud of them.
Gotta love a Solera barrel. Like a lot of people don't understand that concept, but those giant casks, right, where you can fill.
Yeah, my 19 are 600 liters.
Yeah, that ain't small for all you folks counting out there who don't know liters.
And again, it's another. Well, mind you, they would technically obviously be a first fill sherry, but they're very old casks. Mine are a little over 50 years. And, when you look at the bung's all worn. I mean, it's the really, really old cask.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Wow.
So, I mean, I think this is what's really interesting is that rum can lean its way into any type of whiskey drinker's heart and even a wine drinker's heart because of the flavors and profiles it brings. And that's what I've learned today is the distillation is unique. The raw materials are unique, but the flavor profiles can lean its way depending on how you put it in the barrel and how you blend it. So my last question for you, Richard, really is like, you all have a variety of casks, palletized warehouses, like when it comes time to blend, like what's that like to blend these different casks and to get the flavor profiles that you're looking for? Obviously, especially in these like vintages, like are you looking to meet a certain need or just kind of like this is how you're kind of feeling and that's where you all want to go? Like
so the vintages obviously are in a sense more straightforward. They're not going to visit very wildly, obviously, from year to year, but I do tend to sort of, I do get to kind of, sort of go with the trends a little bit. I sometimes explain to people that I was a little more conservative with 04 and 05. And then when I sort of won my audience over, I sort of took them a little more deeper down the rum road with things like 07 and 08 and 09. So in some senses, the 04 and 05s may appeal more to the bourbon drinker, like especially like straight off. If you sort of brought a first person in, you might introduce them with that. But the idea is sort of I'd won a base with those. So I was sort of, I've hooked you now. So let me walk you on this road down in rum. With the other ones, it's really about what's turning the age. So, when we come next year, 2023, we look at what's turning. So we look at what's turning 12, we look at what's turning 13, 14, and we have a little peep and a little taste, and, and we see what we get excited about.
So Scott, after your first a few sips of aged rum, like, of the two, you have two really good aged rums. Like, which way you leaning?
Yeah, I mean, it's been eye-opening. And I do agree with what you were saying about the 2010 being very bourbon appealing. But I kind of lean towards the sovereignty. It's got some more notes that I am accustomed to, or I seek out. It's, coffee, cocoa. It's like a thick cinnamon syrup. And then obviously there's like a pop of fruit there too. But I'd drink either one of them again. That's for sure.
Yeah. I mean, that's how I felt. Like, I wanted to tell this story. I wanted to have this conversation the moment I left the distillery, because first of all, you had a great tour guide. Dario was phenomenal. But the rums we tried, like, I left being confused and saying whiskey, not because I drank a ton. It's because the rums that we tried were reminding me so much of whiskey that I wanted to spread that gospel, spread that conversation.
I think one of the things that would have happened too is if you put a whiskey next to it, then you would suddenly get shocked by how different. Because obviously when you're going and tasting rum and you coming from a whiskey background, you're going to instantly recognize the things that you like and the commonalities. But yes, if you then put them side by side, then suddenly all of a sudden, then the corn is going to jump right out and slap you next to the rum.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. But it was just like those similarities. It was like there was another spirit that I could like latch on to that I really enjoyed. That wasn't my traditional corn backed bourbon.
And this is why again the bourbon guys have been a great audience for us. Not because they're switching to rum, but they're adding rum to their range, and this is what they found very attractive.
100%. And I'm super excited that we were able to get together tonight, Richard, and discuss everything Foursquare and just the distillation process, the differences, the raw materials, and then even some of these great rums that we had. I keep wanting to call them whiskeys because I get a lot of those notes, right? But we truly appreciate your time tonight. And so we would like to, give you the opportunity. Where can people find out more about Foursquare and everything that you all are doing?
That's a good question. So probably following me on Facebook is probably your best to get any news of releases, and if we buy some new casks, although it's not necessarily a good thing to find out what casks I bought, because what I'm buying today won't be released for a long time. But yeah, I mean, that's probably the best source of dynamic information would be following me, we have a Foursquare page, and of course my personal account. That's probably it. Ultimar, of course, also their page on Facebook would post when releases are out and things like that, and so that would probably be the best. Usually, we don't have one sort of repository where you can sort of find out everything there is to know about Foursquare, and that's fine, because I think I'd rather you sort of gradually sort of accumulate knowledge and understanding than try to become a Foursquare expert in 24 hours.
Well, there's a really deep, complex dive. Scott, you're getting the crash course. How do you feel? Do you feel like you could answer the test and pass?
I think I got to read a couple books on rum. I think I know a whiskey writer that actually wrote a pretty good book on rum. But
Fred
Minnick. Yeah, Fred Minnick.
Yeah, so Fred's been out to Foursquare, and he's a good friend, and he's been very helpful, introducing rum and introducing me to some of the bourbon enthusiasts and the bourbon drinkers, and helped me to learn a little bit about what the bourbon drinkers like and what they search for.
And I think he also said that you guys were the Pappy of rum, but we won't talk about Pappy because then the shit will disappear. So
yeah, well, he meant it. He meant it as a compliment, so therefore I'm taking it as a compliment.
Amen.
Oh, I think he did. That's what I'm saying. Is people need to pay attention now, right?
Yeah. Well, and
the thing is, that's the trouble when someone small like us goes to the U.S. The U.S. is a hungry beast, and we're only a little small, 1/10 of the size of Rhode Island. So yes, we can be easily swamped. So
it takes 8 hours to do a bus trip and stop at Rihanna's birthplace and her new house along the way. That's what it took us. And we also had an hour long lunch and ate some marlin, and the marlin was fantastic.
Very good.
Yes.
Very good.
The fresh fish in Barbados and the hot pepper sauce.
If you're in Barbados, eat fresh fish.
Yes. And the hot pepper sauce, you got to have it. It's just amazing.
Yes. It's one of the best pepper sauces around the world.
I bought a whole liter home. It's all good. We just keep on going. It's eggs every morning and a little bit of hot pepper sauce, and life's good. So, Richard, we really truly appreciate you joining this episode of the Bourbon Lens.
Thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it. It's great to have an opportunity to speak to a completely new audience. Thank you.
Yeah, well, and we're excited, listeners. Just don't miss this boat. We told you about American Single Malt and you missed it. Don't miss the rum boat. We're early on it. You need to get on it. It's huge. It's going to be huge. And Foursquare Rum is where you need to be. I promise you that. So thanks everyone for listening to this episode of the Bourbon Lens. We truly appreciate it. As always, you can find out more about us at Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. You can also check out our new email, info@bourbonlens.com, and you can find out conversations with Scott and I. We'll be right there. We'll answer everything you got. Go over to our website, check out everything we got there, bourbonlens.com. Last but not least, make sure you go and give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. We truly appreciate it. And until next time, cheers.
Cheers.